Good evening and welcome to Politics Nation. Tonight's lead, in her own words. I'm coming to you from Atlanta, Georgia tonight, where just a couple of hours ago I sat down with Vice President Kamala Harris. We spoke about the historic nature of her race as she is now facing as an extraordinary historic campaign with just 16 days to go until the election. In just 3 months, that election will take place. Vice President Harris has managed to introduce herself to the American people and pull into a dead heat in the polls. Now she's seeking to draw contrast and mobilize her supporters in the final days of the race, including African American voters. Meantime, her opponent, former President Trump, is ending with an increasingly hostile and erratic closing message. And that's where we start. Here is my exclusive interview with Vice President Kamala Harris. Well, thank you for allowing us on your birthday to sit down and talk.
Of course, Raph, it's good to be
And
with you.
I want to get to the Georgia vote and other issues, but let me ask you, as Vice President, and if you hopefully not presented with it, but as President, with Sinwar having been killed, how would you move toward a ceasefire? What do you think the United States should be doing?
So first of all, look, it's going to be hard. It's going to be difficult, but we have got to get this war over with. We got to get the hostages out. We need the war to end. In fact, we're sending Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, out next week to go and meet with the parties there. And the death of Sinwar, I believe, has removed an obstacle to that end. And so we've got to work at it, and we've got to work at it through diplomatic means, and that's what we intend to do. But listen, the reality of it is that the difficulty of it all is not new to any administration in recent history, and it cannot be the reason that we don't work at it around the clock and be vigilant, and that's what we're going to do, and I think it's very important that that's what we do.
And balance. I mean, I remember in Selma, you made very strong statements about civilians being killed on both sides, and you stood up strongly on that. And I think that's a concern in all communities.
Well, I mean, listen, the number of innocent Palestinians that have been killed in Gaza, it's really unconscionable. And we have to be honest about that. And at the same time, listen, I will always stand in terms of Israel's right to defend itself. And we need this war to end.
We're in about a little over 2 weeks to the election.
Yes.
I have to ask you about your opponent. He used a very ugly term about you last night, using the S word as vice president. And how do you react to this kind of street talk from someone who wants to be president again, that was president? I've known you a long time, and I know you have thick skin, but I'm not asking you as a person, because I know you're used to that. But what does it do, in your opinion, to the standards we're setting for our young people all over the country when we're using this kind of locker room street talk about an opponent for president of the United States?
So the American people deserve so much better. That's how I come at it. And to your point, the president of the United States must set a standard, not only for our nation, but understanding the standard that we as a nation must set for the world. You know, we as representing the United States of America walk into rooms around the world with the earned and self-appointed authority to talk about the importance of democracy, rule of law, and have been thought of as a role model, imperfect though we may be, but a role model of what it means to be committed to certain standards, including international rules and norms, but also standards of decorum. And what you see in my opponent, a former president of the United States, really is, it demeans the office. And I have said, and I'm very clear about this, Donald Trump should never again stand behind the seal of the President of the United States. He has not earned the right. He has not earned the right. And that's why he's going to lose.
I remember 1972. I was 17, going on 18. I worked as youth director for Shirley Chisholm's campaign for president. And I was stunned that some of the backlash she got were from black elected male officials saying they didn't want to support a woman. They went with other candidates. I think it was George McGovern. And I hear these people talking about black men that are pulling away from your campaign, though I've not seen any real evidence of that. Do you think some of the resistance of some men, black and white, is misogynist? And are you proud to see that most Americans, even being polled, have no problem supporting a woman at all? And I'm one that lived from Shirley to Kamala in terms of these campaigns.
And I have an emotional reaction to you raising the point of Shirley Chisholm, because it is on her broad shoulders that I stand, and so many of us stand. And we have come a long way, to your point, and on your specific point about including the fact that I have the support of countless black men who are in elected positions, including I'm just this afternoon and 2 church visits today with the mayor of Atlanta. That being said, I think that you are absolutely right, that there is this narrative about what kind of support we are receiving from black men that is just not panning out in reality in terms of when I go to last night Atlanta and had, I think, 10,000 people at a rally. I will also say this, Rev. I am very clear. I must earn the vote of everyone, regardless of their race or gender. And what can be frustrating sometimes is to have journalists ask me this question as though one should assume that I would just be able to take for granted the vote of black men. I think that's actually an uninformed perspective, because why would black men be any different than any other demographic of voter? They expect that you earn their vote. And that is why I am talking and presenting my policies in a way that are, of course, for all Americans, but I will also speak about the specific impact that I can see it having on different demographics of voters.
Well, we're talking about black men, and let's talk about blacks in general.
Yeah.
Because one of the things, you know, I've been on a nonpartisan tour at National Action Network and Central Park 5 and others. And one of the things that reporters ask, and we don't get it from the audience, is what about the Kamala the cop? And I said, well, I knew her as DA.
Right.
You and I go, that she was one that wanted people with marijuana arrest not to go to jail.
Exactly.
And Attorney General wasn't even under your purview. I mean, do you think that this is orchestrated, that they're trying to find some way to separate you from some elements? Because you used to be attacked for being too progressive as a district attorney.
I know. You know what? Here's the thing, Rev. We are, as of today, Sunday, 16 days away from the election for President of the United States, and there are all sorts of people who are going to throw a bunch of things out that will include mis and disinformation with the intention to dissuade certain people from voting. And that's not new. And so that is why I'm spending time in all communities to make sure that they hear directly from me so they can judge for themselves in a way that is unfiltered. And I'm going to continue doing that. I am leaving nothing on the field in this election, leaving nothing on the field. So I sit with you this afternoon after visiting 2 churches today, this Sunday morning. Yesterday I was in Michigan. Tomorrow I'll be in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And I'm leaving nothing on the field.
The black vote is important, but Georgia's important.
Yes.
Wisconsin's important.
Yes.
And how do you, as you go, dealing with your economic message? I know a lot of people that call my radio show that says, well, what happens, how does this impact my pocket?
Yeah.
I don't know what you mean, Reverend Al, with inflation reduction. I don't know what infrastructure means.
Right.
Share with our viewers on what has impacted them and what a President Harris will do that understands what needs to go in their pocket, not the Beltway language.
So it's a very legitimate and important question the voters asked that we should respond to on the affirmative without waiting for the question. So, for example, how will it affect individuals? Part of my plan is to expand the child tax credit to $6,000, and in particular to target young parents in the first year of their child's life to make sure they have the resources to buy a crib or a car seat or clothes, because, you know, we know that the vast majority of our parents have a natural desire to parent their children well, but not always the resources, especially when you also recognize that we did this, which is expand the child tax credit for less than I'm proposing now. But when we did, we reduced childhood poverty in America by 50%, black childhood poverty reduced by half. Part of my plan is to deal with the home health care of seniors. And I tell a personal story. I often go off script to tell a personal story. When my mother was sick, as it turned out she was dying from cancer, I took care of her. And to take care of an elder relative means to try and cook something they feel like eating or can eat. It means trying to put clothes on them or give them clothes that don't irritate their skin, to help them put on a sweater. It means trying to figure out a way to just bring a smile to their face from time to time, to say something that might make them laugh. It's about dignity. And far too many people who are taking care of elder relatives are struggling, because to do that means often they may have to leave their job, which means they're going to reduce their income, or they have to pay down their savings to qualify for Medicaid. So my plan is to recognize this is about dignity and to say that should not have to happen in order for you to have help to take care of an elder. We're going to have Medicare cover it. And I think about this issue also in the context of people who are in the sandwich generation. And that's what we call people who are taking care of their young kids and their parents.
Wow.
And shouldn't have to think about leaving their job or losing all of their savings in order to apply for Medicaid. These are examples. I talk about what I intend to build, which is an opportunity economy, which in large part understands the vast majority of Americans have ambition, aspirations, they have an incredible work ethic, they have dreams, but not necessarily access to the resources that allow them the opportunity to achieve their goals. Unlike my opponent, who thinks about the world differently, I think informed in large part by the way he experienced life, having been served $400 million on a virtual silver platter, which he then filed bankruptcy 6 times. My opponent, who, when he thinks about tax policy, it's about cutting taxes for the richest among us, billionaires and the biggest corporations, who can afford, by the way, to pay their fair share. His plan for what I call a Trump sales tax would be at least a 20% tax on everyday necessities, which economists have estimated the average American will pay $4,000 more a year. So when asked this question about how will this affect my life in terms of a voter worrying about the fact that, look, price of groceries is still too high. I get it, they get it. And what are we doing to help them actually get through life in a way that they're not just getting by but getting ahead? We have to have specific policies that do that. And that is what I offer under what I call an opportunity economy approach. But Donald Trump is offering something very different, including what he's talking about in Project 2025. And I'll tell you, from the biggest rallies I do to church services, people know what's in Project 2025. Right. They know that it would allow corporations to basically stop protecting the right of workers to have overtime pay. What it would do to take away the independence of the Department of Justice. And as we know, he intends to use it to attack his political enemies. People are very concerned by what Project 2025 would do, which is to get rid of public servants who have dedicated their lives to doing public service and instead putting loyalists in these various agencies so that he can have them bend to his will instead of do the work that is in the public trust.
Last question. I'll go back to where we started with Shirley Chisholm. Today's your birthday.
Yes.
And we all reflect on our birthdays, what our life would mean. You called me on my birthday. Thanks again. What do you want 50 years from now, history to say about Kamala Harris?
I hope that, and I really do work that my life will have proven to have been a life that is about fighting for the people, fighting for the dignity of people, work that has impact in a way that uplifts the people, all people. I do hope that's what history will say.
Some little girl or little boy is going to be talking about you like you talked about Miss C, Shirley Chisholm. Thank you for doing this. On your birthday.
Thank you, Rev. It's good to be with you again.
All right.
Thank you.
Believe it or not, we are just 16 days out from the election. And right now, it's pretty safe to say that these candidates are closing out their campaigns in slightly different ways. I mean, Kamala Harris is trying to fire up her base, getting people off the couch out to vote. She's holding big rallies with huge stars like Lizzo and Usher, getting people excited. But she's also at the same time trying to expand her base of support by doing things like walking right into the lion's den of Fox News. And on the other hand, there's Donald Trump.
Arnold Palmer was all man, and I say that in all due respect to women, and I love women. But this is a guy that was all man. This man was strong and tough. And I refuse to say it, but when he took showers with the other pros, they came out of there, they said, oh my God, that's unbelievable.
So there is that. And yes, the stories about Arnold Palmer's anatomy and the 30-minute dance sessions he did earlier this week might help explain why he and his team are avoiding more public exposure. I mean, just look at the last few weeks. He has ruled out participating in any more debates against Kamala Harris, refused to commit to a CNN town hall, backed out of an interview with 60 Minutes, backed out of an interview with CNBC, backed out of an interview with NBC News, and even canceled an appearance at an NRA event in Georgia originally slated for next week. I mean, an NRA event, everyone. What is safer for Donald Trump than that to attend? And we should point out, in case you don't remember, this is all a noticeable change from just 4 years ago. Because 4 years ago, by the end of October, Trump had done an interview with 60 Minutes, had been grilled at a town hall by NBC's Savannah Guthrie, and he had already debated Joe Biden twice. But now, in 2024, he pretty much just hunkers down among friends in safe spaces like Fox News, which even that, apparently, according to Trump, isn't friendly enough.
I'm going to see Rupert Murdoch. I'm going to tell him something very simple because I can't talk to anybody else about it. Don't put on negative commercials for 21 days. Don't put them. And don't put on their horrible people that come and lie. I'm going to say, Rupert, please do it this way. Right. And then we're going to have a victory.
I love the scratching of the head on the side of that couch. I mean, look, here's the thing. Even that very comfortable-looking couch for Trump is not comfortable enough. So kind of all of this raises two very big questions. Why is Trump backing out of so many things, less than 3 weeks out from the election? And why is he only comfortable in a very narrow set of safe spaces, which continues to narrow? I mean, another explanation for all of this is that when he does attempt to answer basic questions, it always seems to go a little something like this.
Should Google be broken up?
I just haven't gotten over something the Justice Department did yesterday, where Virginia cleaned up its voter rolls and got rid of thousands and thousands of bad votes, and the Justice Department sued them that they should be allowed to put those bad votes and illegal votes back in and let the people vote. So I haven't gotten over that. A lot of people have seen that. They can't even believe it.
The question is about Google, President Trump.
The question is about Google, President Trump. I mean, that was quite a journey he took us down there. See what I mean, though? Or, I mean, maybe he's canceling interviews and events because his team doesn't trust him. According to the New York Times, some of his allies and advisors are concerned about his scattershot style on the campaign trail as he continues to veer off script. Pretty sure the 12-minute story about Arnold Palmer ending with that shower scene didn't exactly calm those concerns. Or maybe Trump is ducking this stuff because he's simply too tired. Politico reported this week as well that when Trump dodged yet another interview commitment this week, one of his advisors explained to that outlet that Trump was, quote, exhausted. Now, unsurprisingly, the Harris campaign has started to seize on all of this, even posting a video of what appears to be a very sleepy Donald Trump during a campaign event on Friday. Now, I point all of this out because in a campaign and during a period of a campaign where literally every day and every hour of every day matters, it's notable that one candidate is falling asleep at his own events, rambling about Arnold Palmer's anatomy and avoiding basic questions. That's information that people should take into the voting booth with them. Of course they should. And right now, Kamala Harris and Barack Obama, who's out on the trail for her, are trying their hardest to make sure they do.
Now, he's ducking debates and canceling interviews because of exhaustion. Have you noticed he tends to go off script and ramble? And generally, for the life of him, cannot finish a thought. And he has called it the weave. But I think we here will call it nonsense.
You would be worried if your grandpa started acting like this. You would. I mean, right? You'd like call up your brother, your cousin or something and be like, hey, have you seen Grandpa lately? What are we going to do? But this is coming from somebody who wants unchecked power. We do not need to see what an older, loonier Donald Trump looks like with no guardrails.
Have you seen Grandpa lately? We should all be asking that. I mean, the bottom line here is this. Whatever Trump's reason for canceling all of these interviews, whatever his reason for hiding out in his increasingly smaller safe spaces, it's all very telling. And what it tells us is the story of one candidate who is open to being tested, who is willing to do the hard work, who's going on Fox News, an environment's not exactly friendly to her, who's calling for a second debate, and another candidate who is refusing to be tested in any real way at all. Joining me now is California Governor Gavin Newsom. Governor, it's great to see you, and there's so much I want to get into with you, but I do want to start just with the Trump of it all, because what struck me is he's been canceling lots of events and interviews, lots of them. It's quite a contrast, of course, with Harris. But as for Trump canceling interviews and events and ducking another debate, I mean, you're someone, you know him, you've paid attention to his psyche for a long time. What do you think is going on there?
Well, I mean, I've said this from day one, he's weakness masquerading as strength. He's a broken person. And you're seeing that. He's becoming increasingly, and it's remarkable to be able to say this because he's often graded on the curve, but he's increasingly acting deranged, unhinged. The rhetoric coming from the Harris campaign absolutely mimics what we're watching. I mean, you saw that 39-minute curious exhibit of just narcissism at another level, where people had to sort of stare at dear leader as he was dancing or zoning out. I mean, this is a profound and remarkable moment, and I think he's not meeting that moment. I think he's increasingly concerned about his own candidacy himself, and he's going back to these safe places, Fox and Friends again this week, and the questions are yawningly predictable, and he's becoming increasingly derivative of even himself. More and more, dare I say, boring as someone that has followed him closely. He's not as interesting either as he once was.
We learned last week that Donald Trump's former chairman of the Joint Chiefs called him a fascist to the core. In an interview Harris did Tuesday, she was asked about fascism. Let's just play that and we'll talk about it.
It's two very different visions for our nation. One mind that is about taking us forward and progress and investing in the American people, investing in their ambitions, dealing with their challenges. And the other, Donald Trump, is about taking us backward.
The other is about fascism. Why can't we just say it?
Yes, we can say that.
I I mean, this is a question we've all been talking around for a while, including kind of how to describe him. But let me just start with that question. Is Donald Trump a fascist, in your view?
Well, I know it's a loaded word, but when you say you're going to be dictator on day one, I mean, look up the definition of fascism, the characteristics of a dictator, an authoritarian. I mean, General Milley said it himself, but Trump, again, reinforced it himself. He talked about suspending the Constitution. This is serious stuff. You saw this last week, threatening to eliminate funding, including, by the way, to schools in California, $7.9 billion a year we receive in federal money to educate our kids if we don't do his quote-unquote bidding. You saw it a week ago in the middle of disaster recovery efforts with FEMA in the Southeast and places like South and North Carolina. And here he was threatening wildfire money yet again in the state of California. It's the most un-American thing someone can do, let alone a nominee for the highest office in the land. So I don't think it's overstating. But I deeply recognize that those are loaded words. When you use words like fascism, turn some people off. But again, by definition, I think that's a fair assessment from the Vice President and General Milley.
Yeah, and I asked that because exactly as you said about the definition of it, and as you just outlined and are the expert on, I mean, what he's threatening as it relates to your state of California that does grapple with wildfires, that grapples with natural disasters. He's been threatening essentially to withhold funding and withhold assistance. Is that something within your government, within your team, you have to plan for and think about if he's elected?
Well, it's something I don't even not only planned for, experienced. This is exactly what we experienced in the few years that I did work with him. I mean, this is not new. People need to understand this. We had to make calls. We had to grovel with the President of the United States, who personally needed a call to do the right thing for millions and millions of Americans. By the way, millions that actually supported him as well. He's the most un-American nominee in my lifetime. I mean, this is serious, serious stuff. He's becoming increasingly unhinged, and as the Vice President says, unstable. The unethical nature of him is next level. We experienced this, many governors, not just myself, and now he's just bloating out very much in the open and expressing themselves in a much more transparent way. Wake up to that reality.
Donald Trump's increasingly dangerous rhetoric, like when he calls Democrats the, quote, enemy from within, it is very similar, dare I say nearly identical to the rhetoric of Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini. That's according to a new piece in The Atlantic that argues Trump's intent with that language is to dehumanize his opponents. Why? So he can do whatever he wants. As our next guest, Michael Cohen, knows all too well, it is one of the many ways Donald Trump threatens people that he disagrees with. Never forget this moment from his congressional testimony in 2019.
How many times did Mr. Trump ask you to threaten an individual or entity on his behalf?
Quite a few times.
50 times?
More.
100 times?
More.
200 times?
More.
500 times?
Probably.
Joining us now is the ex-president's former personal attorney, Michael Cohen. He's the host of the Michael Cohen Show on YouTube, the podcast Mea Culpa, and the co-host of the podcast Political Beatdown. He's also the author of Disloyal, a memoir, and Revenge, How Donald Trump Weaponized the U.S. Department of Justice Against His Critics. Michael Cohen, I could just imagine that you have lots of thoughts this morning.
You can only imagine. Look, there's so much that's going on, and it's not just Hitler or Mussolini. These are words, actually, that Joe McCarthy used to use, the enemy from within. And we know all about Joe McCarthy. But we also, of course, know about Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. Why he's taking this route, I have no idea. But look at the timeline of Trump. Look at how it started going back to 2015, 2016, when he came down, he descended from the golden escalator, and he started talking about Mexicans. And after Mexicans, he went to blacks, and he went to immigrants, and then he went to Jews, and then he went to the homosexual, the LGBTQ plus community, then transgender, then he went to, and now all of a sudden, I mean, we can just go on and on. He's talking about Haitians and people from the Congo and Venezuelans. Now, all of a sudden, what's he talking about? Arnold Palmer's junk? I mean, let's be serious. This is not a man who the people of the United States should want to have as their representative when you have to deal with serious leaders around the world.
So Mike, to continue on that point, here's how The Atlantic sums up Trump's rhetoric of late. Several generations of American politicians have assumed that American voters, most of whom learned to pledge allegiance to the flag in school, grew up with the rule of law and have never experienced occupation or invasion, would be resistant to this kind of language and imagery. Trump is gambling knowingly and cynically that they are not. And I would agree with that assessment.
I do as well.
I was going to ask you, how do you see that gamble playing out?
I do as well. And one thing that we've talked about here on this show, and I've spoken with you offline as well, Mike, about it, I was unconstitutionally remanded. You know, we're all talking about trying to sane-wash the words that Donald Trump says. Donald Trump used the Department of Justice. He weaponized the Department of Justice in order to prevent me from putting out my first book, Disloyal, and had me remanded back to prison, placed back into solitary confinement during COVID, right? For what? Violating my First Amendment constitutional rights. You know, this case now is, there's a writ of certiorari before the Supreme Court of the United States. It's with Justice Sotomayor. If you think that this is just an anomaly, that I'm the first political prisoner held by my own country because I wouldn't waive my First Amendment constitutional right, every single person that's watching this program needs to understand that it could be them next. There are no more guardrails against him, especially as a result of the recent Supreme Court decision of presidential immunity. He will take everything to the nth degree.
Michael, I want to jump in, but I think your face tells me you have like a lawyer question you want to ask Michael Steele.
No. I just agree with Mike. I think that we're at a very interesting moment that Donald Trump is still able to carry out and behave the way he has been behaving. And yet the American people who grew up pledging allegiance to the flag, understanding the rule of law, are willing to capitulate and give that over to this guy, knowing to what Mike just said, that their constitutional rights could be abridged if they run afoul of Donald Trump.
Mike, these are also the same people who spent their lives, for example, in church praying with a Bible that didn't contain the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. I mean, I don't understand what's going on. Donnie Deutsch said it this morning on Morning Joe, where he turned around and he goes, I don't understand what's going on and what the American people are thinking these days.
That's a rerun, sir, just so you know when you were watching.
Oh, I apologize.
Lest someone's like, Donnie Deutsch, okay. Here's my question to you. What's happening with him? Like, there's something, right, there's a certain amount of this that we have seen over the course of the last 8 years. There's also a piece of it that feels like something new, a page turn, his own campaign admitting that he's exhausted.
Well, not only does he look exhausted, he's behaving like somebody who's exhausted. Mm-hmm. But I think it goes more than that. He doesn't look well, and he's certainly going off on these. I'm not a doctor, so it's not fair to me to say, but it's dementia. It appears to be in line with what one would classify as dementia. He starts rambling about anything or everything. He doesn't want to have a conversation anymore, so he starts dancing for 40 minutes. And the part that irritates me the most is when people start applauding. Oh my God, he goes like this, and then the crowd starts applauding. What's funny about that? It would be funny if it's Saturday Night Live, but it's not funny when you're talking about the president of the United States of America, the guy who's leading, right, one of our two political parties in this country. So what's going on with him? I also think that a lot of it has to do with the 4 indictments that are still remaining. It's like the 3 plus the 1 superseding, the 34 counts of guilt, the $600+ million that he owes in civil fines as a result of both E. Jean Carroll and the New York Attorney General case. He knows that if he doesn't win that his entire legacy, his entire life, his finances, everything about him is going to be completely destroyed. So he's not running to become president of the United States. He's running to protect himself, his legacy, and his money. Mostly his money.
Michael Cohen, what do you want the American people to truly understand about your experience and with Donald Trump, particularly the Justice Department, how you were targeted? And I say this because there are lots of folks, well-meaning folks that don't even, well-meaning people who support Donald Trump, and then people who do not, that still say, I don't think he's really gonna, he sounds a little out there, but I don't think he's really gonna do any of these things. When, to your point, it has happened to you, it has happened to others. And so now what we are potentially facing is, if in fact he is elected, he's being very clear about what it is he would do.
Well, he's 100%. First of all, I happen to be the only political prisoner right now to date who's been incarcerated, remanded to prison because I refused to waive my First Amendment constitutional right. And that's what I'm hoping that the Supreme Court will take up in the writ of certiorari that's currently before them. Mark my words on it, though. When he says that he intends to go after his enemies and his critics, why are you not listening to him? Let us all stop sane-washing his words. I don't understand how, whether it's the J.D. Vances of the world or the other acolytes, the sycophants that are out there, and say, well, that's not really what he meant. He's not going to do that. There are no more guardrails up for Donald Trump. One, as a result of the Supreme Court recent decision, and two, because he's already gotten away with it. Knowing what he did to me, that was the beginning. That was him creating a playbook for the future.
Joining me now is the Democratic Senator from Arizona, Mark Kelly. He's a member of the Armed Services and Joint Economic Committees, as well as the Select Committee on Intelligence. Senator, good to see you. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me on, Ali.
One of the reasons why Arizona continues to be a critical swing state is because Arizonans are directly affected by so many of the top issues in the election this year. It's a border state. You've got a 15-week abortion ban in effect here, but you've got Prop 139, an abortion vote to enshrine abortion rights. It's a state where Donald Trump's election denialism really took hold, and it's a state where people are concerned about the economy. I would love to know what kind of conversations you're having with people as Election Day approaches.
Yeah, it's about those issues. This abortion ban, I mean, it's the one we have today. We had an 1864 abortion ban for a while given to Arizona women from Donald Trump. I mean, he talked about how he broke Roe v. Wade. That's why we wound up with that 1864 ban. Now we have a 15-week abortion ban with no exceptions. It is harming women in our state significantly. They're having to flee to other states to get the reproductive care they need. You also mentioned being a border state. We had an opportunity to really fix this problem the way it's supposed to be fixed through legislation. Donald Trump killed that legislation with Senate Republicans. They were about to vote for it. We had the votes. He told them he was pretty straightforward about it. He said he needed this for the campaign, so it was killed. That really hurt Border Patrol. Border Patrol pay didn't go up. We couldn't hire more Border Patrol agents. We didn't get the fentanyl detection machines that we needed to stop illicit fentanyl from coming through our border and killing our citizens. That was done by Donald Trump. So those are the issues that Arizonans are thinking about. And because of that, there's incredible enthusiasm for Kamala Harris in this election. We have 120,000 volunteers. We've got 200 paid staff, 19 field offices. Barack Obama was just here in Tucson a couple days ago. The amount of enthusiasm in this 2024 election is sort of off the charts. And for that reason, and because we have a better candidate and they have in Donald Trump somebody who's unfit and unstable, I believe Kamala Harris is going to win Arizona. She's going to be the next president.
Let's talk about immigration. You just mentioned the bill that didn't happen. A lot of your colleagues in the Senate, including your fellow Senator Kristen Sinema, came really close to that bipartisan bill, which, you know, and Arizona is a great place to talk about this because it was not perfect for everybody. There were a lot of Democrats who didn't like some of the things in there. There were a lot of Republicans who didn't like some of the things in there. But it was going to move the discussion about the border a little further. It was kept alive as a potent election issue. Every time I'm in the car here in Arizona, I just hear nothing but ads that have to do with immigration. This is a perfect example of a problem that was getting closer to being solved that was not solved by Donald Trump and his lackeys in Congress. How do you move forward with a topic like that?
Well, I think what's unfortunate here is the misinformation from the other side. You know, some of my Republican colleagues saying this wasn't good legislation. We had the votes. I mean, dozens and dozens of votes from Republican senators. And then the former president, Donald Trump, just lying about what was in the legislation. There was money to build infrastructure. This legislation was supported by the Border Patrol Union. They wanted it. Sheriffs in southern Arizona wanted this legislation. It was wildly popular, you know, here in the state until Donald Trump woke up one morning and told Senate Republicans to walk away from it. They ran away from it. Not all of them. A few of them just stuck there because it was the right thing to do. James Lankford, who was the Republican senator who negotiated the legislation, very conservative guy, he got a deal that Republicans had wanted for years. This was not meeting them at the 50-yard line. I mean, it's Sunday, so I'll use a football analogy. This was not meeting them at the 50-yard line. It was like on the 10-yard line on our side of the field, defending the goal. I mean, that's what the legislation, you know, how it was looked at. There were a lot of popular things in there for me. I represent a border state. These were, you know, key components of a plan that we needed to strengthen our border security. But because Donald Trump, it's now been delayed. Kamala Harris said she will sign this legislation. I think when Donald Trump is gone, after he loses, we're going to bring that legislation back. We're going to get it passed. We're going to get it to her desk in January. She's going to sign it. Border Patrol pay is going to go up. We're going to hire more agents. We're going to get those fentanyl detection machines. We're going to build the infrastructure we need.
Joe Biden won Arizona by fewer than 11,000 votes. It was 0.3% of the total votes. But from a numbers perspective, it was the closest, the closest margin in 2020. Polls suggest it's similarly close this year, and it's likely going to come down to voter turnout. There continues to be concern that young voters, men of color, are not as engaged with this year's election, and that could be a problem for Democrats. What are you seeing in terms of enthusiasm and turnout?
Well, whether it was with Kamala Harris in Glendale a couple months ago, 15,000 people in a stadium, or about 4,000 or 5,000 for President Obama here in Tucson, a smaller community, the enthusiasm is off the charts. I was at the University of Arizona a couple days ago meeting with students. They're really excited. Some of these are first-time voters. They know that the next president is going to have an effect on their lives much longer than the rest of us, than you, than me, than seniors, the issues that they care about. You know, climate change being one of them. Women's reproductive rights being another, the economy. I mean, Kamala Harris has a plan, like a real solid plan to bring down the cost of housing, increase pay, help with the price of health care and education. Donald Trump has nothing. I mean, he literally does not, he can't even say he has a plan. All he says, he has a concept of a plan. I mean, right. I don't even understand what that is.
It's been many years of all of us thinking about health care, but he's got a concept of a plan. Senator, good to see you. Thanks for joining us this morning. The Democratic Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona.